All right, Exodus chapter 15 is where we're going to be this morning. Kevin got you through the Red Sea last week. One of the greatest stories in all the Bible, the children of Israel going through on dry ground. I love that story. And then, I love in the children's version of it, the animated Prince of Egypt movie, it's got Moses putting that staff in the water, starts going like this. And then all the water, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. All the water just goes up in the air. The next slide, is it going? Next one. There it is, yes. Okay, and all the water goes up, right, and they walk through on dry ground. And there's that one iconic scene. I mean, it's great cinematography for an animated film where the lightning crashes and you see that whale. Next one. Yeah, there. Yeah, and all these people are walking through and there's this lightning crash and this huge fish. What that must have been like to experience this. They were about to die. The Egyptians are chasing them. The sea opens up and they walk across the sea on dry ground. But what happens? The Egyptians come with them, don't they? And they're like, all right, let's go for it. And they chase them down in. But then what happens? God says, Moses, lift up your staff and whoosh. Next slide. Yeah. And then, man, they get covered up and all their enemies are gone. They're never going to come get them again. And you can just imagine that scene. And then, they turn and they look across the sea and it's calm. And the next picture, this is actually the beach right there, probably in one of the sites that archaeologists think that they would have crossed. And that's the scene. And you're looking out there and your enemy's gone and it's morning. And man, they had a party. The Bible says that Moses made a song. And I get the idea that if you think about it, like how slaves in America in the South, they would often sing while they were working, and we have a whole genre of music, many wonderful spirituals that came from that labor out in the sun and singing a song as they worked. And I kind of get the idea that might be what Moses did, is that he took a tune that they were used to singing and just began describing the Lord's goodness. And they, maybe he would say a line and then they would say a line right after it in kind of that spiritual format of music. Or maybe it was like a cadence. I know when I was in high school, we had some clever juniors and seniors on our soccer team. And when we were running laps, they would make up sort of an army cadence, da 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 da. And we'd join something in. And they had some clever things that they'd weave in about the coach or different things like that into the cadence. And so I think that's what Moses is doing. And so there's 5 stanzas. I'll let you look at this one on your own, but there's 5 stanzas to Moses' song. The first one, he's praising God for his triumph, first couple verses. Second couple verses, he's declaring God's strength over the enemy. Third stanza, God's power in defeating Pharaoh's army. Fourth stanza, Moses is saying God's majestic. He executes judgment on his enemies. And then in the last one, he praises God's uniqueness, his holiness, and his leadership of his people. And they're having a party. And then it says in verse 19, and again, they're on the seaside, and when Pharaoh's horses and chariots and charioteers rushed into the sea, the Lord brought the water crashing down on them. But the people of Israel walked through in the middle of the sea on dry ground. Then Miriam, this is Moses' sister, the one who had been there at the beginning of the story, watching from the reeds as her brother was put in the water. Miriam, the prophet Aaron's sister, took a tambourine and led all the women as they played their tambourines and danced. And Miriam sang this song, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. He has hurled both horse and rider into the sea." It's a lot shorter song. She was more succinct than Moses. And they're having this big party. And they're standing there, they're looking at the sea. And they're high-fiving each other or whatever. This is a glorious day in their lives. And they're looking across the sea, and then they turn around and they see this. Next one. Desert. Mountains. No Dollar General. No water. No food. It's an arid place. If you go to Google Earth and you look up these areas where they think that the crossing would have happened and where they came across, there's nothing. No crops, no trees. It's a barren desert. It's really similar to what we would see in the American West, in California, Nevada, places like that. So they've had this great miracle, There's no Egyptians chasing them anymore. But now, that's what they're faced with. They can't go back. The sea just covered up. There's no way to get back the way they came. There's no wood to build boats out of. They got to go forward into a wilderness. And so you can imagine as the party dies down and they turn around and look at what's before them, it's a little bit sobering. Verse 22, Moses led the people of Israel away from the Red Sea, and they moved out into the desert of Shur. They traveled this desert for 3 days without finding any water when they came to the oasis. Now let's just think about this for just a second. Let's just imagine all of us started walking down Route 19 for 3 days. From here, right now. How many of you are making it past day 1? How many of you might get into day 2? There's a few people that might, no supplies, right? No good sneakers. Just walking down the road. They left Egypt in a hurry. Now they've walked for 3 days. I was in Death Valley last February in the desert. You had to keep drinking water just to not dehydrate, and I was only out there walking around for a couple hours. They're walking for days in this environment, 3 days. No water. I imagine whatever canteens or they had these sort of primitive water holding devices. They're starting to get empty. You think the little children are saying, we're thirsty? Mommy, I need something to drink. They've got animals. They got people. It's dry. It's hot. And it says they came to the oasis, and they probably had sent some scouts out there, and somebody came back and they said, we see some trees, some palm trees up here. It looks like there's an oasis. And somebody's like, yes, that's awesome. Let's go that way. And you can imagine, the word has to get back through the crowd. Most scholars, the conservative number is about 1 million people, because they had 600 men who could bear arms. So probably talking about 1 million people with animals and everything else, have all on this massive beach, and there's sufficient room in each of these potential landing spots. If you look at it on the map, for this many people to start walking up through probably what was a dry riverbed, just like what you would see in California, where there's only water at certain times of the year and the rest of the time you can just walk through it. That's probably what they're walking through, is like a dried riverbed for 3 days, and somebody says, we found water. Our prayers have been answered. We're turning this way. We found some water over here. But look how the verse continues. They came to the oasis of Marah. The water was too bitter to drink. So they called the place Marah, which means bitter. Man, have you ever had something that you thought was an answer to prayer, and it ended up being Marah? The water's bitter here. We can't even drink this stuff. I thought God was answering my prayers through this situation, and instead, the water's bitter. Well, the people complained and turned against Moses, as you can well imagine in verse 24. The people complained and turned against Moses. What are we going to drink? They demanded. This is just an odd verse. I wish I knew more and understood more about the spiritual significance of this verse. So Moses cried out to the Lord for help, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and it made the water good to drink. That's all we know. God's like, hey, there's a piece of wood. Moses was like, what's this going to do? And it made the water good. I don't know. That's all we know about it. He throws this piece of wood in the water and it makes the water. God performs this miracle. He purifies the oasis. The thing that didn't look like it was an answer to prayer now becomes an answer to prayer because God intervenes. And the water was good to drink. So everybody was happy, right? No. It was there, though, at Marah, that the Lord set before them the following decree as a standard to test their faithfulness to him. These are people who can physically see a pillar of cloud, pillar of fire. They have come through the Red Sea. They have seen all the plagues in Egypt. They have personally experienced all of these things within the last month and a half at the most. But God wants to test their faithfulness. And he said, if you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, obeying his commands. Remember, we're not at Exodus 20 yet. They don't have the 10 commandments yet. This is all the buildup. Obeying his commands, keeping his decrees, then I will not make you suffer any of the diseases I sent on the Egyptians. Remember, one of the early plagues was the water was unfit to drink. This water was unfit to drink. God has purified it. And he says, if you'll trust me, you're not going to face any of the stuff that came on the Egyptians. Verse 27, after leaving Marah, the Israelites traveled on to the oasis of Elim. And I don't know about you, but I'd be thinking, what's going to be wrong with this place? But this place is wonderful. They found 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there beside the water. Now, this is great. It's an oasis, but it's kind of like, have you ever been on a long road trip and you stopped at a rest area? Or maybe you stopped at a Chick-fil-A and they had like the little place for the kids to play, and the kids didn't want to leave the rest area? Or the Chick-fil-A, they wanted to stay there and play because the toys were fun. And you're like, wait, vacation's way better. Where we're going is way better than, don't quit at the rest area. God doesn't want them to stop here. This is just an oasis. It's a place where they can find some refreshment on their journey. And God mercifully supplies this. 12 springs of water, some shade, some palm trees. But it's still scarce. I mean, the supplies are still scarce. Then it says, the whole community of Israel set out from Elim. And they journeyed in the wilderness of Sin. Now, this doesn't mean transgression against God. It's probably short for Sinai. Between Elim and Mount Sinai. They arrived there on the 15th day of the second month, 1 month after leaving the land of Egypt. Now, if we walked for 3 days down 19, it'd be rough. They have been walking for 30 days. We're not talking about people that had great hiking shoes or anything like that. They're dragging everything they've got with them. They've got their animals with them. And they've walked for 30 days. It's hot. The resources are scarce. There too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had just killed us when we were in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around with pots filled with meat. We ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. There's really an accusation against God here. God did just save us to starve us. It's like they're not really understanding the character and nature of God. God doesn't save us to starve us. Were the Israelites justified in some of their complaining? Let's just look at life through their lens for just a minute. Okay? So, first of all, they're following Moses, right? And remember, right at the beginning of this story, if he leaves Egypt and he turns left, he will go to the promised land in like a week and a half. He turns right and goes south. And it says they were now on the long road. So we can't follow a GPS. He doesn't seem to have a plan. He's just kind of like flying by the seat of his pants. Imagine, if you will, the logistical nightmare that these folks are living through. 30 days of hiking and camping in a harsh climate. These aren't trained survivalists. Constantly packing and unpacking. How many of you just love packing suitcases and unpacking suitcases? I mean, and that's we're talking about, we don't like that when we're at the Holiday Inn. They're in the middle of nowhere. Packing up, unpacking. Up, time to move again. They're not in charge of the schedule. It's moving slow. The sun just relentlessly beating down on you all day with no shelter. Not trying to be crude, but the waste management of that many people and animals is unimaginable. I mean, how many latrines would you have to dig? I mean, it's astonishing. It's really mind-boggling to think about how they would keep any kind of sanitation. I've been to concerts, maybe you have, where they didn't have enough porta potties. There's zero. There's zero. And it's been 30 days. The scarcity of food was a real problem. By now, by 30 days, any leftovers they had from the Passover meal and whatever they had stored from Egypt, come on, it's gone by now. Have you ever packed up a bunch of snacks when you went on vacation as a family, and by the time you stopped at the first gas station, you're already out of food? Yeah. I mean, because I don't think any of them fathomed that it was going to be this long. So resources are depleted. So I can have a little bit of sympathy for the Israelites here. I kind of feel like, I wish I had great faith. I'd probably be one of the complainers if this was me. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Look, I am going to rain down food from heaven for you. Each day the people can go out and pick up as much food as they need for that day. I will test them in this to see whether or not they will follow my instructions." Do you think they passed the test? Okay, yeah. "On the sixth day, they will gather food, and when they prepare it, there will be twice as much as usual." Again, the Ten Commandments are not yet instituted, but God's already building in the concept of Sabbath. So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "By evening you will realize it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. In the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaints, which are against him, not against us." Moses and Aaron are like, "Hey, this isn't our problem. We don't have any food either. We don't have anything to drink either. You're complaining against the Lord. You're not complaining against us. What have we done that you should complain about us?" Then Moses added, "The Lord will give you meat to eat in the evening and bread to satisfy you in the morning, for he has heard all your complaints against him." What have we done? Yes, your complaints are against the Lord and not against us. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Announce this to the entire community of Israel. Present yourselves before the Lord, for he has heard your complaining." And as Aaron spoke, the whole community of Israel, they looked out toward the wilderness, and there they could see the awesome glory of the Lord in the cloud. And I just want to say, when I read these passages, I'm so thankful for how merciful and patient and long-suffering the Lord is. Because, I don't know, if it was me and I just parted the Red Sea and did all this stuff, and then they were complaining, I'd be like, it's lightning bolt time, forget it. But God's merciful. All throughout the Old Testament you see this. Slow to anger, merciful, patient. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the Israelites' complaints. Now tell them in the evening, you will have meat to eat. In the morning you will have all the bread you want, and then you will know that I, the Lord, am your God." As if they didn't already know this. It's astonishing. That evening, vast numbers of quail flew in and covered up the camp. This was early chicken nuggets. Not a whole lot of meat on a quail, I don't think. And the next morning, the area around the camp was wet with dew. When the dew evaporated, a flaky substance as fine as frost blanketed the ground. The Israelites were puzzled when they saw it. "What is this?" they asked each other, and they had no idea what it was. And Moses told them, "It is the food the Lord has given you to eat. These are the Lord's instructions. Each household should gather as much as it needs. Pick up 2 quarts for each person in your tent." So the people of Israel did as they were told. Some gathered a lot, some only a little. But when they measured it out, everyone had just enough. So you think about it. Some people are thinking, this is amazing. But they're also thinking, boy, we didn't have very much food. I'm going to get a little extra. They're gathering it. Other people are like, I'm kind of skeptical of this. They're just getting a little bit. I'm like, is this really going to work? Is this really worth my time? But when they measured it out, everyone had just enough. Those who gathered a lot had nothing left over. Those who gathered only a little had enough. Each family had just what it needed. Then Moses told them, "Do not keep any of it until morning." Do you think they listened? But some of them didn't listen and kept some of it until the morning. But by then it was full of maggots and had a terrible smell. Moses was very angry with them. After this, the people gathered food morning by morning, each family according to its need. As the sun became hot, the flakes that they had not picked up melted and disappeared. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much as usual, 4 quarts for each person instead of 2. Then all the leaders of the community came and asked Moses for an explanation. And he told them, "This is what the Lord commanded. tomorrow will be a day of complete rest, a holy Sabbath day set apart for the Lord. So bake or boil as much as you want today and set aside what is left for tomorrow. Here they are in the desert. They've been scarce on provision, and God has provided for them for a whole week. And he says, but listen, the Sabbath day, let's keep it holy. This is the beginning of this. I don't want you having to gather on the Sabbath. I mean, think about it. These are slaves who have probably worked every day of their life. Their grandpa, their great-grandpa worked every day for the Egyptians as they were slaves. And now here they are, and they're in the wilderness, and God says, listen, it's going to be different if you follow me. Everybody gets a day off. What did Jesus say in the New Testament? Come unto me, all ye who labor and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you. And Sabbath is supposed to be that little picture of rest. Verse 24, so they put some aside until morning, just as Moses had commanded. And in the morning, the leftover food was wholesome and good without maggots or odor. And Moses said, eat this food today, for today is a Sabbath day dedicated to the Lord. There will be no food on the ground today. You may gather the food for 6 days, but on the seventh day, it's the Sabbath. There will be no food on the ground that day. Do you think they believed him? Some of the people went out anyway on the seventh day, verse 27, but they found no food. The Lord asked Moses, how long will these people refuse to obey my commands and instructions? They must realize that the Sabbath is the Lord's gift to you. That's why he gives you a 2-day supply on the 6th day, so there will be enough for 2 days. On the Sabbath day, you must stay in your place. Don't go out to pick up food on the 7th day. So the people did not gather any food on the 7th day. The Israelites called the food manna. It was white like a coriander seed, and it tasted like Nilla wafers. Or Krispy Kreme donuts. I'm going for Krispy Kremes. Then Moses said, this is what the Lord has commanded. Fill a 2-quart container with manna to preserve it for your descendants. Then later generations will be able to see the food I gave you in the wilderness when I set you free from Egypt. So Moses said to Aaron, get a jar, fill it with 2 quarts of manna. Put it in a sacred place before the Lord to preserve it for all future generations. And Aaron did just as the Lord commanded Moses. He eventually placed it in the Ark of the Covenant, in front of the stone tablets inscribed with the terms of the covenant. So right there with the 10 Commandments in the Ark was this jar with 2 quarts of manna in it. So the people of Israel ate manna for 40 years. Until they arrived at the land where they would settle. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. The container used to measure the manna was an omer, which was 1/10 of an ephah, which held about 2 quarts. So what's the takeaway from chapter 15 and chapter 16? First of all, there was that part about the bitter water. And sometimes God has to purify the oasis, the thing that you think is going to be the answer to everything, but you find it to be a little bit disappointing in the end. There's a lot of those things that happen in life because this world is cursed by sin and things are a mess, and God has to purify. We depend on the Lord, not on the waters of Marah. Secondly, there was this part where they were despairing of their salvation. God had brought them out with a mighty hand, and yet they were like, it would have just been better to die back in Egypt. And I just want to say, and if you've been following Jesus for a long time, you already know this to be true. If you've only followed Jesus for a short time, this might come as a surprise, but deciding to follow Jesus doesn't mean that the road's going to be easy. In fact, for most people, when they decide to follow Jesus, what happens? The road actually gets a little more difficult. Things can be troubling. Now, some things might get better, but other things will get worse. And it's this thing about trusting and walking with God and trusting Him through the trials and the difficulties of life. And when you face trials and when you face tribulations, we're not supposed to despair and say, it's better if I wasn't even a Christian. But sometimes it gets tempting. David in the Old Testament, do you remember? He said, God, why is it that these wicked people, they got everything they want? No problems in the world. And yet people who are trying to follow you, we got all these trials and difficulties. It's easy to despair, and I just want to challenge you, don't despair of your salvation. What God begins, he completes. And Jesus said this to his disciples, I am with you always. We don't face trials alone when we're following Jesus. Thirdly, there was this part about the manna and the Sabbath, and that not only deals with God's provision that God provides for us, but God also requires, he wants us to have rest. Have you been to Sam's Club or Costco and you're walking down an aisle and all of a sudden you smell like this delicious like sausage cooking, and they've got some lady over there, she's got the griddle going and a bunch of sausage, right? And you have to put on a disguise 15 different times to walk by and get a different thing, because eventually they catch on that you're the same person. And what do they want? They want you to buy the whole sausage, but they just give you this little bite, right? Listen, Sabbath, when we as Christians practice Sabbath in our life, guess what we're doing? We're showing the world, hey, this is just a little bite of what God's kingdom is going to be like. Because God's kingdom is one of rest. It's one of joy. And so that's why I think that practicing the Sabbath, and I want to challenge you on this. We're in the new covenant. 100% I get that. Okay, like I'm not bound by all those kosher laws and things that were in the Old Testament. But the principle of Sabbaths actually starts in Genesis, not on Mount Sinai. And in this passage, we see that the principles of Sabbath preceded God giving them the law. So that 1-to-7 ratio is important. I know, I get it in our culture. Certainly the slaves in the New Testament church, which much of the New Testament church were slaves, they couldn't always predict what their schedule was going to be according to what their master scheduled. But we try to incorporate rest, Sabbath rest, into our lives because it's a testimony to those on the outside. It's that little bit of sausage on the toothpick that makes people think, I think I want the whole thing. God provides and God requires. And I just want to say, God has not led you out. He hasn't saved you to starve you. That was their accusation against God. You saved us just to starve us? That shows that they really didn't understand. No, listen. If God has saved you, he didn't save you to starve you. He saved you to bless you. And I'm not talking like health and wealth and prosperity gospel. But my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches and glory. God saved you to bless you. Lastly, save a little bit of manna. And they put that thing in the jars, and it was a testament for future generations. Listen, when God answers a prayer for you, tell your children about it. Tell your grandchildren about it. Write it down so that your great-great-grandchildren can read about it someday. Because children sometimes need to borrow from our faith while they're still forming their own. Listen, I don't think that my faith was really mature till probably my late 20s. And I went to Bible college before that. A lot of my life, I was borrowing from my parents' faith. I didn't have all the answers, but I was like, no, they follow Christ, and here's how they exemplify trust in God and faith towards God and how they practice things in their Christian life. I was borrowing a lot of theirs and incorporating it into mine until it really became my faith. And so please understand, like your children, your grandchildren, sometimes they kind of have to borrow from you. I'm not talking about borrowing for salvation, not saving faith, but just borrowing for that forming faith. When they don't have all the answers, they can look at your life. They can look at the answers that God has given to you. So save a little bit of that manna. Father, I pray that you'd help us. Thank you for the lessons that we learned from these people long ago. God, help us not to despair in your salvation. Help us to believe wholeheartedly that you have not saved us to starve us, but you love us. We're your children. You care for us. You provide for us. And Lord, let us trust in you, even when the times look difficult, even when the waters are bitter. Let us trust you, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.